I'm sorry, having trouble. There we go. Kimberley has ideas about how to sort of an advocacy project around this. And I wonder if, Kimberley, you want to start us off with describing what you have in mind when you talk about the need for legislative language that could pave the way for more cemeteries to open. Hold on. Can you unmute yourself? For some reason, I'm having trouble doing that. There you go.
Is that good? Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here this evening. So Billy started Memorial Ecosystems way back long ago in the Middle Ages. And anyway, we've been doing this for about 22 years. His goal when he first started out was to save 2 million acres. Over this period of time, I've been amazed at how many people have approached us from so many different avenues, from the for-profit side, from the not-for-profit side, from the spiritual side, from people who have individuals who have farms who want to save their farm, developers, you know, so many avenues where for us creating these conservation burial grounds that have this other protection that really are viewed to sustainability for the planet, for a good use of resources, places for spiritual contemplation, places that have direct influences in their local communities and benefit for educational purposes, for environmental education, for things not just that the place is a cemetery, but that it holds, and that is a very respected view, but that it holds other values and other uses in the community that are sustainable. And so we've had so many people come to us over the years who are so enthusiastic, but have been held up by the laws that have sort of restricted them. And of course, in different states, there are different laws. So sometimes things can be very difficult to kind of track down. And either people have to come up with a whole bunch of money at first, you know, and if they've got to buy land, and if they're in a metropolitan area, that a lot of times is a lot more expensive, but sometimes being in a rural area, you can't have the traffic that you need to sustain that. But I started thinking, you know, about what the roadblocks were for us when I'm lying awake and looking at the ceiling at 3 o'clock in the morning and saying, what's the magic thing here? And it came to me that it comes down to these restrictions that we have for a particular type of cemetery now. But we're I feel like we are creating a new model. And I'm not saying we don't need any laws. I think that we definitely need standards and guidelines and restrictions on some things so that people don't greenwash it. They don't have the ability to do that. I think we need to be able to come up with something that is clear and easy to follow, but has a different, and not that we do away with any of the laws that we have at the moment, but I'm just saying I think there could be, and maybe there is an avenue or a possibility for creating a different set of laws for the creation of conservation burial grounds that serves the public in a way that that they are protected, that the needs for legitimacy, that this isn't just a fly-by-night Blair Witch Project thing where you go and dig a hole in the woods and throw the body in there or something like that, or where you have, you know, you buy 2 acres off the side of the interstate and, you know, plant a couple of butterfly bushes and call it a butterfly, you know, nature preserve. There need to be real laws, but that there needs to be an avenue where this can be streamlined a lot more easily, a lot less, with less barriers for people. So that is where I heard about the wonderful Tanya Marsh and thought, well, gosh, this would be interesting to look at the history of cemetery law, where it came from, who it's trying to protect, what is it trying to do, why, you know, where those kind of laws came from. And in sort of following that, how we might be able to do something for this new model of burial or creating these new spaces.
Fabulous. Thank you. That's a great way to get things started here, thinking about what we need to do. So let's move over to Tanya. Tanya, what's your response to that? What kind of, wondered if you might start laying out sort of what those levels of legal requirements are.
Sure. So let me talk a little bit about the barriers that Kimberly just mentioned. Am I echoing a lot? Is that okay? Okay. I'll do my best. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the barriers, and then I'm really looking forward to hearing people's questions, and if people have specific questions, we can go into more detail on things. So cemetery law in the United States is state law. And so it's a matter of both state common law, which is judge-made law. It's made in a series of decisions over the past couple of centuries. And it's also statutory law. Cemetery law varies significantly from state to state. So a state like New York has a very old, 100-plus-year-old statutory system. It's very intricate. There's lots of restrictions. There's lots of rules. And then as you move across the country and you get to the West Coast, California has a lot of law, Washington State, Oregon have a lot of law, but Nevada, Colorado, Utah, a lot of those states really have surprisingly very little law. So some of it is a function of how long a state has been a state, who settled there, when it was settled. A lot of different sort of factors go into the variety in state cemetery law. There are a couple different places in state statutory codes that you're going to find statutes that relate to cemeteries. So the first is whether or not cemeteries are required to be licensed, whether they're regulated by the state. In the vast majority of states, at least some cemeteries are licensed or regulated by the state, but there are some big exceptions to that. And this gets to the question that Kimberly mentioned in terms of what is the law trying to accomplish? Who is it trying to protect? As far as I can tell, cemetery licensure laws are primarily about consumer protection. And they were put into place in most states 50 years ago or thereabouts, because there had been people operating for-profit cemeteries, at least anecdotally, and you would go buy burial plots, and then the folks who own these cemeteries would take your money, and they take a lot of people's money, and then they just abscond with it. And so they didn't take care of the cemeteries, they didn't follow through with their obligations, you had abandoned cemeteries. Abandoned cemeteries are a real issue for the states. So most states put into place these requirements that cemetery companies have perpetual care funds, endowment funds, where at least a specific percentage of the amount that a person pays for a burial plot gets placed in trust. That's protected in various ways by different states. But the idea is that you have this untouchable pot of money that's going for the perpetual care of the cemetery, and the human people that are running the cemetery can't take the money and abandon the cemetery and then leave it to the public cost. It's important to note that not all cemeteries are licensed or regulated. So for example, in the state of North Carolina, we have about 30,000 cemeteries. One of my poor students a couple years ago counted on a genealogy website. There's about 30,000 cemeteries. There's only about 100 that are licensed by the state. And that's because in a state like North Carolina, the vast majority of cemeteries are private family cemeteries. They're not licensed by the state, or they're owned by religious organizations. They're not licensed by the state, or they're owned by municipalities. They have a separate set of laws, but they're not licensed by the state. So there's only about 100 cemeteries that are actually subject to those kinds of licensure laws. Then you'll also see statutes in health and safety codes, things like burial transit permits, vital statistics kinds of statutes. Those can come into play with respect to a cemetery too. And then there's also pre-need statutes. So if things, typically other than the burial plot itself, but if you pay in advance for opening and closing fees, for example, or you pay in advance for a vault or a tombstone, you're not receiving that merchandise or those services until the time of need. In many states, cemeteries are required to place that money into a different trust so that the owner of the cemetery doesn't get the cash if the consumer hasn't received the goods and services yet. That varies a lot from place to place in terms of whether those pre-need laws apply to cemeteries or just to funeral homes. And then you have another layer of regulation that we need to worry about with cemeteries, which is local law, because zoning codes have a lot to say about where cemeteries can be located, what kind of restrictions are placed on them in terms of minimum or maximum size, what kinds of amenities they have to have, et cetera. So we really need to worry about local law in terms of zoning, if it's applicable, and then we need to worry about state law. Those are the barriers.
Wow. It's a lot to keep track of. And I guess I'm thinking about this from the point of view of someone who wants to start a new cemetery. And like, can you run us through sort of generally what you think the trajectory would be from I've got this great idea to opening a cemetery? And I know it's going to be different in every state, but generally what would you say are the hit points that you do?
Sure. So if you're thinking that you want to start a new cemetery, you need to think about it both as a real estate deal and as a business deal, right? So when you're thinking about the real estate, you really want to try and identify a parcel of land that you think would be good for that purpose, right? And then go through all the kinds of land use due diligence that one would do to make sure that piece of land works for that particular purpose. So that's not really about the law. That's about having consultants come in to look at drainage and, access and whatever else you're interested in, right? And so from the real estate perspective, you need to look at local zoning laws. What zoning classification does that piece of land already have on it? Or if you're far enough out in a rural county, in some states you're unzoned. Now in North Carolina, pretty much everything is zoned, even fairly rural places. But in some states you get outside the municipality and you're in unzoned territory, and then you don't have to worry about local zoning codes. So if it's zoned, it's rural land, it's zoned agricultural, it may be that agricultural already permits a cemetery. It's more likely that a local zoning code has a special category for cemeteries. And so you'd need to go to the local zoning board and get them to rezone the property for the use that you're contemplating. So before you purchase that piece of land, you want to feel out the local government to see how difficult it would be to get that land rezoned. If they're absolutely opposed to it, or they put a lot of conditions on it that are going to make the project too costly, et cetera, then you might want to go look at a different piece of land. So that's sort of the real estate side of it. From the business side of it, you need to find out what is going to be required at the state level to allow you to operate that business. Do you have to be organized as a nonprofit? Do you have to be licensed as a cemetery? Does that require you to have a minimum acreage, or does it put a cap on a maximum acreage? In North Carolina, you're required to put up a sum of money at the outset to pre-fund your endowment fund, that perpetual care fund. Not every state has that kind of requirement. So you need to go through the cemetery. In North Carolina, it's called the Cemetery Act, right? So it's the portion of the code that talks about licensing cemeteries and figure out what the rules are. So you need to think about both the real estate aspects, that's usually more the law at the local level, and the business aspects, which is more law at the state level.
Phew, that's a lot to take in.
It is. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I add one more thing?
Please.
You need to hire a lawyer. That's by far the most important thing. You need to hire a lawyer who knows something. You're probably not going to find a lawyer that knows a lot about cemeteries, but you need to hire a lawyer, especially if you have to rezone that property, that knows a lot about handling matters in front of the zoning board in that county, somebody local.
Right, right.
And if I might chime in here, this is exactly what I was talking about to begin with, the complexity of these different laws all across the country and, you know, from state to state. Because what we are trying to do, and one of the things I think that is so interesting about what we're trying to do with conservation burial is not necessarily create cemeteries. I know that sounds counterintuitive. We are looking at these spaces that have ecological value for the community for hopefully for hundreds of years from now, that encompass, that offer burial, but also have other values along with that, not just a cemetery. And, you know, the thing for me, Tanya, is for many people, I feel like as soon as you say the word cemetery, or you say, I'm trying to create a cemetery, this is what happens, is this whole kind of thing of things go off in your head where this is what you're being aimed to. And I see, you know, I'm looking at municipalities, for example, who might be looking, who need open space, or they need open space for mitigation for the kind of development that they're doing, that can, you know, where conservation burial grounds aren't just cemeteries, they're offering true green space. Gainesville, Florida is a really good example of that, of where the county became involved. And, you know, anyway, it's, and then there's, so it's sort of, and as far as looking at sites, like you're saying, the real estate parts of things, you know, position in landscape for conservation burial grounds are really important. It could be that land trusts and open space groups who have done tremendous amount of work with GIS models, looking at future development and where development is going, and are also looking at the plants and what's on the ground and what needs to be saved or might be endangered or something, where this could be, this model of conservation burial could be really beneficial, you know, to the community. And you kind of, you're meeting a lot of different aspects. So this is why I'm saying, is there's some other way of looking at this and streamlining for those requirements?
Right, because the definitions of a cemetery in the state code are simultaneously really broad and really limited in scope of what they're imagining. They are imagining a cemetery as it exists in most places today, like the one that is in the picture behind me, where you have, it's all divided into lots, and then there are tombstones, right, et cetera. I mean, that's what they have in mind. And they've been really broad-minded in adding mausoleums, right, and niches, and allowing the scattering of cremated remains. That's about as much modernization of cemetery statutes that we've seen in the last half century. So I don't know of any state that has a category at the state licensure level for green cemeteries. They don't have any special rules for them. They don't prohibit them. They don't put any roadblocks up for them. There may be statutes that just don't apply, especially for conservation burial, in terms of some of the requirements that may be inconsistent with what you're trying to accomplish. But it's really like the state statutes have just never heard of this concept.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, because this is one of those fascinating things about when you you know, you learn about laws that were on the books 100 years ago about, you know, not being able to kiss in a truck if you're, you know, barefoot kind of laws. You know, I mean, those are real things. So what are the specific things that can really slow us up, that maybe one of the ways that we could streamline legislation state by state? One of the things that I'm thinking about is platting, right? The plat requirement of, you know, lining people up like little soldiers, the way we do in lawn cemeteries. Can you think of any other examples, things like that, that we could perhaps approach, you know, pretty easily, sort of low-hanging fruit that we could remove from the state statutes? to
Well,
make it
most
easier?
states are going to require you to survey and plat the cemetery before you sell burial plots, but there's no state that requires plots to be lined up in any particular way, or there may be a minimum size for a burial plot. In most states, there's a minimum square footage, but there aren't any maximum limits. So there's no reason that we can't, if what you're selling as a cemetery to a consumer is a real property interest. So it's something akin to an easement. You're giving them the right to use real property that you own for a particular purpose. That is the interment of human remains. That's a perpetual right. Those human remains are protected forever. So you can't sell a real property interest without exactly delineating where that land is. So I don't think we're going to get rid of requirements to survey and plat cemeteries, but it is probably true that state cemetery commissions, to the extent that they have to approve those plats, have not been thinking about them in the same ways that we're thinking about them in more of a natural burial, conservation burial.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, now with that's sort of like, I think the platting and the grid design is sort of a 19th, early 20th century kind of solution. You know, now we have GIS, we have GPS, we have the ability to map probably even more intricately than they could in the 1800s and 1900s. And different ways of storing that data, which is very important. You know, when people come to Ramsey Creek, for example, one of the first questions they say is, how's somebody going to be able to find me? You know? And I think it's something that, you know, that's one of the things that looking at consumer protection and what consumers want is important.
I think most state cemetery commissions have never heard of GIS. I mean, that's not true that they haven't heard of it, right? But the state law doesn't contemplate, because the state law in so many respects is stuck in 1950 or 1890 or 1850, right? And so it is an investment of resources to try and get state legislatures to yank all this law into the modern day. And I think every cemetery would be better off if we were able to update some of those old statutes about platting and surveying and reflect some of the new modern technology, right? It may particularly benefit the things that we're trying to do, but it would really benefit everybody.
So that's one point right there, is that's a legislative change that we could be asking for. Can you think of others that might be sort of universal? I know not every state is going to be the same, but what other roadblocks seem to come up frequently? I know the endowment is an issue, although, as you say, that's more of a contemporary safety precaution. That doesn't seem like an obstacle to me, but I do know, I mean, I know of one cemetery owner who got everything in place, followed everything, state by state, county, everything, had it all in place. And the last thing was, okay, so no, where's your check for $75,000? Which came as a total surprise.
Is that North Carolina?
No, actually, it's a southern state, but that is a consumer protection piece. So that isn't something we want to mess with. I'm thinking more about archaic things that are in the way. And on the flip side of that is another question I have for you. I worked with the Vermont legislature twice to change the laws there. And interestingly, there was nothing on the books that prohibited green burial or starting a green burial cemetery or anything else, but there were people who insisted that the legislature give it their approval. So they built these laws out and they changed laws and made it even more difficult. And they completely missed the critical pieces, like changing the burial depth from 5 feet up to 3.5. So we had to go back to the legislature again. It seems as though we're sitting on both sides of this issue, which is, can we fix the stuff that's wrong, and can we not put roadblocks in our own way? What would you say to that?
So I think, you're right. We're never going to get rid of the endowment funds. And I don't know that we would want to advocate to get rid of the endowment funds, because abandoned cemeteries are a huge problem, and they're not in anybody's best interest. And because the endowment funds were put in place pretty late relative to the history of a lot of cemeteries, there are no endowment funds for most of the old burials, right? So they have to bankroll the maintenance of the cemetery in the future based on all the burials that have taken place in the last couple of decades. So those are already fairly problematic. But there are state statutes that limit what cemeteries can use those funds for, that are definitely thinking of a more traditional cemetery that has improved roads, that has monuments, that's maintaining landscaping in a way that's not consistent with the kinds of things that we're talking about, right? So it would be useful, I think, to look at some of those state statutes, see how they're written, and see if the way that they're constraining how you spend endowment funds is inconsistent with natural and conservation burial.
Perfect. There's point 2 right there. Wonderful.
Yeah. Then there's also some states that limit burial to one person in a single grave. I think there's a lot of folks that are really interested in having grave recycling legalized in more states, that it's only permissible in a handful of states right now. There's some states where you can have double depth burials, but then sometimes that's limited only to people who are married, or to a parent and a child if the child died when they were a minor, et cetera. So I think what we really need to do, if we want to think about cemetery reform, is go state by state and just pull all the statutes and ask for each statute, why? Why is this restriction there? Does it serve a purpose? Does anybody remember what purpose it is supposed to serve, right? Is it to protect consumers? Is it to protect health and safety? Or is it to institutionalize a method of doing things that was socially acceptable at the time when the statutes were put in place? And I think that we can pretty easily separate those two categories of things. If it serves a legitimate health and safety purpose, serves a legitimate consumer protection purpose, or it's just institutionalizing our vision of a cemetery as it existed in 1950. If it's in that second category, then we need to think about, if it has no rational basis for health and safety or consumer protection, what's the alternative? And are you going to be able to convince people of that?
Yeah, excellent. Let's go back to another point that you just started to sort of cozy up to, one of my favorite topics, and that's the Rite of Sepulcure. Could you explain that and how that affects our ideas about recycling graves?
Briefly, the Rite of Sepulcure?
Briefly.
Well, which part of it? The part that you get an easement and it protects human remains forever?
Yeah, that part.
Yeah, okay. So in the United States, we have this fairly unique idea that the dead have rights. So the dead first have a right to a decent burial. It used to say decent Christian burial. Then we modernized that just to decent burial because the courts finally recognized there are other people in the country. So decent burial, and then undisturbed repose in perpetuity. So undisturbed repose in perpetuity means that once the remains are planted into the ground, the dead themselves have an interest in that real property. And it's incumbent upon the courts to protect the dead's right of undisturbed repose. And in fact, the Supreme Court of the United States has done so. State Supreme Courts, lower level courts have done so. They've stopped redevelopment. They've stopped people from disinterring and reinterring remains in order to protect the deceased right to an undisturbed repose. Surviving family members also have a right to protect the remains, but it is pretty interesting that it is the dead themselves that have this right. Is that what you're referring to, Lee?
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept in the context of what we're trying to do to create more sustainable space, meaning that we want to be able to reuse that gravesite at some point, hundreds of years ahead, so that we're using as much as we can. And this seems to be a barrier to that.
So, This is a really old European idea. This right to an undisturbed perpetual repose. It's a very old Christian idea. It's been around for thousands of years, but that didn't interfere with grave recycling in Europe. And that's because it was considered fine as long as the remains were still in consecrated ground, that they could be removed from the site of the original burial, and then the bones could be put in a charnel house, or they could be put in a mass grave, etc. The really, pre-American Western European way of doing things was just not super particular about tying people to graves. But we also had a church-based burial system in Christian Europe, right? So people were buried in the churchyard. They weren't necessarily buried next to family members. They didn't necessarily have a tombstone, etc. You jump over the Atlantic, start this whole American experience thing. Now we have all this land. So, there's still some Trinity Churchyard in New York City, for example. I think before the Revolution, there were a couple 100,000 people buried in Trinity. They stopped burials in the very early 1800s. There are, more than 200,000 people, I think, easily buried in the very small Trinity Churchyard. So there's just people stacked on top of each other in that churchyard. So in some of those early colonial cities, we definitely have European methods. But in the Chesapeake and in the South, we had all this land, and people could choose to be buried with their family members, and they weren't necessarily going to be buried in a churchyard. So they could do it in a private cemetery or a municipal cemetery or a nonprofit cemetery or whatever. And we could guarantee people the right to undisturbed repose in that one burial spot with their unique marker, because we had all this other land that we could go develop, right? So that really is a kind of unique American idea. At the same time, we have this really extreme idea that we set forth as the rule, and then we break it all the time. We break it if we decide we want a Walmart in that spot. And inconveniently, there are some graves. Well, there's a process you can go through with the state to disinter any remains that are found on that property, and then reinter them in a dedicated cemetery. So there's definitely ways around it. I mean, there have been so many cemeteries in so many cities that have been dug up and moved. Some cemeteries have been moved multiple times.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this feeds into another concept that is related to this, and that is that there are natural cemeteries, conservation cemeteries that are looking at and actually selling plots, selling the right to be buried on the property, as opposed to this being a real estate transaction of purchasing a specific plot. So that's another piece. I'm wondering if is there a legal impediment to offering that, offering the right to be buried somewhere on the property?
I haven't seen any of those. I'm not sure I'd have to look at the particular state law. The thing that makes me really nervous about that is that in most states, the regulations about pre-need sales, that is selling funeral and burial goods and services on before the time of need, they expressly don't apply to the sale of real property interests, but they do apply to goods and services. If you're selling personal property, that is a right to be buried someplace on the property, but you're not getting a real property interest, I think you'd trigger the pre-need statutes in a lot of states. And then you'd have to trust that cash. The cemetery wouldn't get to take it, so they wouldn't be able to use it to buy land, to maintain, etc. Now, if you're only selling that right on an at-need basis, then you wouldn't trigger those. But the Rite of Sepulcure isn't statutory law, it's common law. It's really old, it's super baked in. I don't know how, I don't know if I could contractually give that up, is the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking that might be sort of a third point, is to make sure that we're taking a look at pre-need laws as they pertain to all of these other considerations. So that sounds like a pretty deep dive.
There's a lot of variety in the pre-need statutes from state to state and how they might apply to cemetery companies.
You know, one of the things I find interesting as well is over the years when you look at the growth of cremation over whole body burial, and we talk about consumer protection. You know, we are such a consumer driven society now. I mean, you can even look at 20 years ago, 25 years ago, where we were with consumerism and where we are now. I mean, it's just amazing, you know, with the use of the internet and, you know, various things, what information people can find for themselves about burial law, about funeral law, that before, you know, when somebody died, you didn't know where to turn to, so you just went to the funeral home. I'm amazed at how many people have done so much research online. And a lot of times people come to Ramsey Creek and they say, I want something to, you know, I want to pick out my place. I want to do all of this and have everything taken care of so that my children don't have to worry about it. But when they come there, when this is where in like a conservation burial ground, and I will say for our purposes, we are totally against reusing graves. At Ramsey Creek, we could have taken 10 acres and we could say, this is going to be a conservation burial ground, and we'll just keep on reusing the grave. We won't need to expand our land base. But our whole point, or one of the kind of standards behind conservation burial, is to try to save as much land and contiguous land as possible, because that is better for wildlife, it's better for plants, for a whole bunch of ecological reasons. So when you're coming at developing these places from an ecological standpoint, and a society, you know, this sort of different lens, as it were, it opens itself up to other, you know, to other avenues. But the questions that we get from people all the time are, am I going to be dug up by wild animals? What is this going to do to the water? You know, they think of unembalmed bodies and things like that. But I think also for the funeral industry, you know, why did we get such a rise in cremation? You know, why did people change their mind? What were they looking for? And cremation is considered the final disposition of the body, where you don't even have to use a cemetery at all, which, you know, and so, but, you know, I'm wondering, I find a lot of consumers that come to Ramsey Creek are looking for they have a different set of values and a different sense of, I mean, they're coming to this from a different value standpoint from the kind of laws and the things that are set up with funeral law and cemetery law as it is right now. They don't want to be, you know, in the boneyard. The picture behind you, you know, a lot of people refer to those as the boneyards, you know, so, or places that house the dead that don't really have any other function in the community. So that's one of the reasons, you know, sorry, I've gone off on a tangerine here, sorry.
Tangerine. That's great. Holly, did you want to say something? Oh, you need to unmute.
I'm just wondering if this new trend that is happening in terms of the legalization state by state of natural organic reduction is a sort of a bellwether for us that we have an opportunity to open things up. So I'm from California, and we're now just in the process of bringing recomposition before the state legislature, which I think is very likely to happen because fairly recently alkaline hydrolysis was legalized. So, and then in the state of Washington, they legalized alkaline hydrolysis at the same time as natural organic reduction. So, and I understand Colorado is also working. So, I'm wondering if we're seeing a niche in the wall there, you know, where we possibly have an entry point where we could take advantage of this opportunity for making other things such as conservation burial, bring it more to the public eye.
I think bringing it to the public eye is one question, but you've brought up a really interesting point. And you know, we started out big thinking about state law, and we're also talking about real estate law and so on. One of the questions we got is, can you actually have green burial in, everywhere? So this brings it down for me to a very small place. We don't need all that legislation to tell us in our local cemetery whether we have to require vaults, whether we have to accept steel caskets, etc. So on a very local level, green burial is legal everywhere as long as the locals say yes. Am I right about that, Tanya?
Well, locals don't have to say yes, just the cemetery has to say
Right.
yes. Every cemetery in America could be a completely green place in terms of not allowing metal caskets, not allowing hardwood caskets, not allowing vaults. They could all go green tomorrow if they wanted to. So that is a really important point, I think, because it's a limitation on consumers. Consumers who are limited in their choices often do not differentiate between where the limitation is coming from, right? So in Winston-Salem, if you want to be buried in a wall mausoleum, you have to be embalmed first. And I've been told by people who were given that requirement that that's the law. They said, that's not the law, that's the cemetery rules. But cemetery rules are law if all the cemeteries in the area have the same rule, right? I mean, because if that's limiting consumer choice in a particular market, then it doesn't matter whether the state said it or the local government said it or the cemetery said it. So there is an opportunity, I think, to really advocate with cemeteries, even cemeteries we don't control and own, to try and get them to rethink some of their rules, et cetera. But can I say something about recompose? And what are we calling it now? Natural organic reduction? Accelerated natural organic reduction? I'm horrible at remembering.
NOR is the...
Oh, yeah? Okay. Sure. There's an acronym now?
Yeah, natural organic reduction.
Awesome.
NOR.
Okay. So Katrina, I think, is planning to start within the year, right? Operations in Seattle, which I think will go a long way when she can successfully show people that this is not icky, right? That this is a process that can be carried off and have good outcomes and that families are happy with. I think that can be very persuasive evidence for other states. So it's currently been introduced in California, Colorado, and astonishing to me, New York. And what's crazy about New York, which I told her at the very beginning of this, don't count on going to New York for 20 years. I mean, New York's just going to be one of the hardest places in the country to even get to. The New York State Association of Cemeteries is in favor of it because they think that it can run. In New York, it would have to be operated from cemeteries because crematories have to be operated from cemeteries in New York. But they see it as a really, compatible sort of environmentally friendly option that is consistent with cemetery operations. So I think that was completely unpredictable. I don't know how states are going to look at it, but California, Washington, Colorado, they all legalize marijuana too, right? So I think states that, I just think there's a sort of a connection in terms of how far states are willing to go out in front of the other states on some of these sort of social issues where people's attitudes are changing, right? So I think probably there will be some correlation between the states that were out in front on that and natural organic reduction.
Right. I want to add Vermont to that, by the way. Vermont always being a leader, the first mental health institutions in the country. Vermont, yay!
Did it get introduced in Vermont?
Yeah, this past.
Oh, that's great.
Session. Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah, we got a lot going on up here in New England. I'm checking over the chats, and I think we've kind of rubbed up against most of the questions here. Is there anyone who has not been heard that would like to speak? Just unmute yourself and ask. Yeah, Harold, why don't you go ahead?
I put a little brief thing in the chat. I put a brief thing in the chat, but I just wanted to explain myself because I'm a retired California lawyer. And in California, we are what's called a code state. And Tanya could correct me. I think there's something like 7 states that are code states, which have a philosophy as a practical matter of saying we don't just rely on common law. If the court makes an opinion about something and we like it, we're going to pass a statute that codifies that principle into statute so that everyone will know what the statute is. That's the theory behind it. And so there's a lot less emphasis on common law, a lot more emphasis on what's statutory. And as I'm researching California law and practical situations for new cemeteries in California, I'm really coming up with, well, there's no statute that expressly authorizes it, therefore we cannot assume that just because it's legal in other states that it's legal in California. So I think California is one state, and I think there's 7 states or so approximately that need that statutory authorization. And what we need is an uniform statute example that could be taken to all those states.
I'm sorry, that what isn't legal, expressly legal in California? Green burial, or you're talking about?
Green burial is acknowledged by the state cemetery bureau. But if you talk to any local public agency like cities and counties, which are also authorized by state law to regulate cemeteries or to create a cemetery, I've been told, no, that can't be allowed because you've got to have the 6 feet, you've got to have, all the conventional stuff. They don't understand.
But there's no statute that requires 6 feet in California, and there's no statute in California that requires a vault or a casket.
Exactly, and that's what I'm saying, that as a practical matter, all the local planning departments and board of supervisors and city councils believe what you're saying, that this is the law, because if the cemeteries have this, it must be the law. And we know it's not true, but they don't know it's not true.
Well, you've just opened up the door for one of my biggest rants, so let me get started. When I first started working in green burial advocacy about 14 years ago, I went to my local cemetery trustees. That's how we run our municipalities here in New Hampshire. And I went to this guy who had been a cemetery trustee for 40 years. And I said, do you think, I gave him the idea. I said, do you think we could get this going? And he said, oh no, the state requires a vault. And I said, I don't think that's true. And I had to go to the state attorney general to get a written letter to send to him to say that it was not a state requirement. And I hand delivered the letter to him, and he cried, literally cried, because he was so ashamed that he had forced all these families to purchase vaults for 40 years. So I think this is an open door for us. I'm very much in Kimberley's camp with getting as much conservation land as possible. However, I'm also really attuned to the idea that most of us desire a space that is local to us. We have a sense of place around burial. So we need to open up as much space as we can so people can make their choice around it. And our biggest issue is, we're looking big. We're looking at changing legislatures and so on so that we can get new cemeteries up and running. But as far as getting our municipal cemeteries, our local cemeteries, the ones you're talking about, Harold, this is one-on-one advocacy, relationship building, and just trying to talk to your local people that you elect into these positions to understand that there's a different way of doing things, and that that power is in their hands to change people's lives, and to tell them when you're advocating all of the ways in which this decision affects people. This is a bottom line for me. This is a social justice issue. This is making sure that everyone has access and affordability to something that they have a right to expect in their local community and in their world. So I see this, we do need to do the big A advocacy, but we also need to be doing our local advocacy as well. So end of rant. Got anything? We have a couple more minutes to go, so go ahead.
May I speak?
Sure, please.
I'm Christina Stout. I chair the Columbia University Seminar on Death, and I am currently supervising a capstone project for a group of graduate students at City College, New York. The project is to just figure out how can we advocate for green burial in New York City. And of course, New York City is a city that has no space anymore in cemeteries, pretty much. Just, a few thousand places, that's all. So one of the thoughts that we had considered was the possibility of turning parks into a combination of park and cemetery. And I was wondering, hello, Tanya, good to see you. Are there any other barriers that you're seeing to that than the zoning laws? Now we realize that, it might be a consumer issue, and we actually started a survey to see if we could get some feedback on that. And among younger people, the majority of people would have no problem having a park and cemetery as a combined space. So I'm wondering, what kind of barriers would you see, Tanya, for a city that is trying to become more green, so people don't have to travel and spew out, carbon monoxide while they're driving, 50 miles out of the city to their burial place? Could you comment on that, or would you like to do that separately in case this is too specific for the group?
Well, I can just briefly. So a lot of parks in New York City, especially Manhattan, were already cemeteries, right? And there's still bodies there that they find when they dig in some of those parks from time to time. New York is always going to be a difficult case because New York has the most developed statutory law of cemeteries, and it has had some particular traumas with respect to unmaintained and abandoned cemeteries that the statutes are sort of overprotective in trying to prevent. So, Christina, we can talk about it offline because I'd be happy to try and help your students with that a little bit, but New York is going to be tough.
Okay, well, we'll be in touch. Their project is to line up the barriers and then figure out in the next project maybe how to overcome those barriers.
Okay, good deal.
Thank you.
That's great to hear. I'm loving it that we've got we've got all these interns. Tanya just connected me up with a couple of interns from Wake Forest to do a similar type of project, and I'm finding it's pretty great to find the worker bees with lots of energy to look at all of this stuff. You get past a certain age, and reading statutes kind of puts you to sleep. So I'm grateful.
I don't know how much time we have left, but one of the things I've noticed as well over the years is I would be interested, Tanya, in like cemetery and funeral boards for states and who comprises that board. And to me, that is part of the kind of, as to address Harold's point, what reconstitutes bad information or protective information. It's sort of like the fox watching the hen house. These guys are basically only from the industry, and it seems to me that they are protecting their needs. And they have very few other people on their boards that come from different different parts of the community. And then a lot of times when people are trying to start cemeteries or they contact the funeral home or local cemeteries and get the information from them, so it's a self-perpetuating model kind of thing, in the same way that Harold got that bad information and Lee got the bad information. It's just stuff that's passed over and over and spat out again.
Yeah, that's a key point, and in fact might be the topic for another one of these forums, to talk about what the relationship is with the funeral and mortuary boards or cemetery and mortuary boards to what we're doing. So let's hold that thought for the next time. We are at a little bit after 9, so I like to respect everybody's time. So I think we'll close up shop for the moment. If I see we have more questions, we're going to be capturing all of that, and we'll make sure to get back to you with some good answers. So sorry to cut things off, but it's been pretty interesting for me. I hope it has been for you too. And next time, look for Susan Greer to be managing and facilitating here, and I hope you come back again. So thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.